at all. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Miami federal courthouse loomed like a stone fortress beneath the bruised sky, its marble pillars glinting with the first light of morning as helicopters circled above. Inside courtroom 4B, the tension was already electric. Journalists elbowed for front row seats, cameras clicked like sniper triggers, and federal agents lined the back wall with arms crossed, eyes scanning. This wasn't just a corruption case, it was a political powder keg. Gulfstream Dynamics, a defense contractor accused of laundering millions through phony infrastructure grants, stood trial, and representing the accused was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, not just a legislator, but a former trial attorney returning to the arena that had made her and nearly broken her. The stakes, immense. The courtroom whispered of quiet sabotage, insider connections, and backroom deals stretching from Florida to D.C. But no one whispered louder than the name of the man presiding, Judge Edward Chen, a man feared for his vicious intellect, legendary bias, and icy contempt for anyone who dared to challenge him. Chen entered with the slow, deliberate pace of a man used to commanding rooms by presence alone. His black robe swayed like the curtain before an execution. No greeting, no warmth, only a glance sharp enough to cut glass as his eyes locked onto Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice dry and metallic, "I see you've returned to the courtroom. Last time didn't go so well for you, if I recall." The gallery snickered, a cruel echo bouncing off stone walls. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood at the defense table, back straight, eyes calm, the storm she'd endured hidden behind a veil of steel. "Good morning, Your Honor," she replied, voice clear and unshaken. But Chen wasn't finished. "Let's hope your legal strategy is better than your last attempt, or your client might prefer to represent himself." His words weren't just a jab. They were a scalpel, meant to undermine her authority before the trial even began. And still, she held her silence. But her silence was not submission. It was strategy. But silence, as it turned out, was only the first move in Jasmine Crockett's war of attrition. The storm did not begin with raised voices or overturned tables. It began with steel restraint. As the prosecution launched into a bloated opening filled with conjecture and dramatic flair, Judge Edward Chen let it roll unchecked. When Jasmine rose to object to a line of argument that had wandered far from the bounds of admissible evidence, Chen slammed his gavel without hesitation. "Overruled," he snapped, not even pretending to deliberate. She tried again minutes later, this time to block an exhibit that had not been disclosed in discovery. "Overruled again," he said coldly, eyes never meeting hers. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth, visible only to those watching closely. Jasmine stood there, framed by oak and marble, absorbing each blow with the grace of someone who knew the real fight was still ahead. Her shoulders never slouched. Her voice, when it returned, was never raised. But her fingers, they moved constantly, flipping pages, underlining case law, circling times, scribbling patterns of judicial misconduct with the meticulousness of someone crafting a legal trap. Not just a defense. The imbalance in the room was no longer subtle. It was an open wound. Prosecutors were allowed to ramble, to speculate, to inject emotional appeals that any first-year law student would find objectionable. Chen let them. But Jasmine? Her cross-examinations were cut off mid-sentence. Her citations were dismissed as outdated before the titles were even spoken. "Stick to the facts, Ms. Crockett," Chen interrupted as she referenced a Supreme Court precedent. "This isn't Capitol Hill." The gallery shifted. Reporters blinked. Even a few jurors exchanged glances. But Jasmine's face was carved from calm. Each time he cut her off, she marked it. Each time he raised his voice, she recorded the time. Each inconsistency, each deviation from proper judicial conduct, she logged like a litigator building a case. Not just for her client, but against the man presiding above them all. And still, she made no scene. Because she understood something Judge Chen did not. Sometimes the most lethal weapon in the room is the one that waits. Quiet, patient, and absolutely certain. And yet, as Jasmine Crockett continued to absorb every blow with unnerving composure, the room began to shift in ways too subtle for Judge Chen to detect, but far too deliberate to be coincidence. What appeared on the surface as her silence was, in truth, a precise orchestration. The humiliation, the interruptions, the blatant legal imbalances, she was letting them accumulate, not because she had no counterpunch, but because she needed the weight of injustice to reach critical mass. And at exactly 11:42 a.m., that moment arrived. Without a word, her co-counsel, Reuben Glass, a wiry man with a steel-trap mind and the emotional range of a chess clock, reached beneath the defense table and withdrew a manila folder sealed at both ends. The label was clean but unmistakable. DOJ, Case ID 23, JC789, Priority Classification. In the corner, a federal tracking chip glowed faintly blue under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Reuben didn't hand it to Jasmine. He slid it 1 inch to her left, tapped it once with his index finger, and locked eyes with her. A quiet signal they'd rehearsed a dozen times behind closed doors. Jasmine, still facing the judge, gave no response. No movement, no words. But her hand slowly moved to the folder and covered it, like a queen resting her palm on the throne she was about to reclaim. 2 rows behind the media gallery, a woman slipped in through the side aisle door, unnoticed by the cameras, reporters, or even the marshals. She wore no badge, no overt symbol of authority, just a crisp gray suit and matte black flats that made no sound against the marble floor. Her hair was tied back, severe and neat. From a distance, she looked like another analyst, or maybe an assistant from the U.S. Attorney's Office sent to observe. But the way she moved told a different story. Not like someone finding a seat, but like someone scanning for angles. She chose the far left corner of the gallery's back row, removed a pen from her inner jacket, and uncapped it with a faint click. Embedded in its center was a secure wireless transmitter, DOJ encrypted. The woman was Special Agent Eliza Hart, Internal Oversight Division, Department of Justice. Her presence in that courtroom hadn't been announced. Not even Jasmine had been told exactly when or how she'd arrive. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to let Judge Edward Chen think he was safe, until the very moment he proved he wasn't. Chen, of course, was far too pleased with himself to notice. Ms. Crockett, if this is what passes for legal argumentation where you're from, I suggest your client consider alternative counsel, he said, the condescension in his voice thick enough to spread with a knife. The prosecution chuckled again, loud and smug, but they didn't know what the defense had just put into motion. As Chen leaned back in his chair, self-satisfied and imperious, Agent Hart lowered her pen to the seat beside her and pressed the tiny transmitter. A light blinked red, then green. Thousands of miles away, a DOJ server began syncing live audio and metadata from courtroom 4B, cross-referencing it with a digital timeline Jasmine and her team had built. Timestamps, rulings, procedural denials, all aligned to a precise evidentiary profile. Chen thought he was mocking a public servant. In truth, he had just stepped into the jaws of a federal investigation being conducted in real time. The courtroom hadn't shifted in temperature. It had changed in pressure, and Edward Chen, who'd spent years weaponizing his bench, was now standing on a stage whose floor had just begun to crack beneath him. And while the gallery saw only a woman seated quietly behind the defense table, they missed what truly changed when the court came back to session. The air had thickened, like the room itself knew something was coming. The gavel cracked back to life at exactly 1:31 p.m., but the sound no longer carried the same authority. Something about it felt hollow now, theatrical. The courtroom was more crowded than before. Extra reporters had found ways to squeeze into the back rows, and legal aides now stood silently against the marble walls. Jasmine Crockett remained still as stone at her table, her DOJ-sealed folder resting in plain sight beside her notes, untouched but unmistakably present. Judge Edward Chen entered with a sharp flick of his robe and a forced half-smile, a man trying to reassert control over a stage he no longer fully owned. But he clung to routine like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. "Ms. Crockett," he said, barely settled in his chair, "I had the misfortune of reviewing some of your filings over lunch. It's bold, I'll give you that. Misguided, yes, but certainly confident." He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Tell me, Was that the same level of preparation you brought to United States Verns? Phelps? Remind me again. Wasn't that the hearing where your entire argument was dismissed before opening statements? The insult wasn't casual. It was surgical. A deliberate reach into her record, twisted to humiliate. A direct reference to a 7-year-old case where Jasmine had been handed a ruling under suspiciously rushed circumstances. A ruling later reversed, though Chen didn't mention that part. The prosecution laughed under their breath. One even elbowed his colleague as if enjoying a comedy. Chen continued, his voice louder now, playing to the audience. If you'd like to relive that day here, we can certainly accelerate the pace. I have better uses for this courtroom's time than babysitting rhetorical grandstanding. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't even glance at him. Instead, she calmly reached for a pen and made a small mark in the margin of her legal pad. A dot. Nothing more. But on her private key, it marked the 7th recorded violation of judicial conduct that day. She folded her hands in front of her, looked up, and offered only, "If the court permits, I'd like to proceed with the evidentiary challenge outlined in our supplemental brief." Chen cut her off instantly. "You've already wasted enough paper with those," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "The court will not indulge another detour into irrelevancy." Then with a mocking grin, "Unless you've brought a miracle with your lunch break, Ms. Crockett, I suggest you stick to defending your client, not reinventing the law." The room held its breath. Jasmine's lips pressed together, not in frustration, in readiness. Because while Chen believed he was silencing her, what he had done, precisely finally, was hit the threshold she had been waiting for. The point where his arrogance stopped being an annoyance and became admissible evidence. She turned slightly, made brief eye contact with Reuben, and gave the faintest of nods. The show was almost over, and Chen didn't even realize the curtain was already falling. And just when the courtroom seemed lulled into the pattern of Judge Chen's unchecked dominance, cut her off, dismiss her motion, mock her record, Jasmine Crockett did something that shattered the rhythm like glass. She spoke, but not with raised volume, not with anger. Her voice was measured, deliberate, and impossibly calm. The kind of calm that warned of something tectonic beneath the surface. "Your Honor," she said, cutting into the judge's speech mid-sentence, the first time all day anyone had dared interrupt him. "Under judicial canon 2A, a judge shall respect and comply with the law and shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." The room reacted before the judge did. A few pens froze mid-scribble. The typing from the reporter pool stopped altogether. A juror's jaw visibly tightened. Jasmine hadn't just cited the rules. She had accused him in open court of violating the very code that legitimized his seat on the bench. Not metaphorically, legally. Her words weren't fire. They were cold steel, not meant to inflame but to pierce. She remained standing, eyes steady, hands folded, not backing down an inch. It wasn't defiance. It was assertion. It was a lawyer reclaiming the room, not by volume, but by invoking the law in the exact language that bound the man before her. Judge Chen's reaction was instantaneous and visceral. He pushed back in his chair, lips curled into something between a grin and a snarl, as if insulted that a woman he'd spent all day belittling now dared to frame him within the walls of the very system he thought he owned. "Ms. Crockett," he said, drawing her name out like a warning, "are you seriously accusing this court, my court, of violating judicial ethics?" His voice had dropped in pitch, but risen in venom. The words were quiet, but sharp as razors. He was no longer playing to the room. He was coiling, preparing to strike. Jasmine didn't waver. "I'm not accusing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice flat, professional, and fatal. "I'm formally entering it into the record." The weight of that sentence changed the air again. Not just the meaning, but the legal implication. It was no longer just a confrontation. It was the start of an official challenge. Chen stared at her, stunned, before hissing, "Then I hope for your sake, counselor, you have something more than courtroom theater and a copy of the canons, because if you're going to make this personal, you'd better bring evidence." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She let that moment hang, let his demands settle into the ears of every juror, every reporter, every silent official in the gallery. Then, without breaking eye contact, she moved her left hand slowly to the sealed DOJ folder beside her. She didn't open it, not yet, but the message was unmistakable. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to threaten. She simply let him see what was waiting. And for the first time since the morning gavel struck, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. And when Jasmine Crockett's fingers finally broke the seal on the DOJ folder, the entire courtroom seemed to inhale and then forget how to exhale. She rose, not with theatrical flair, but with the solemnity of someone about to bury something or someone. "With the court's permission," she said, voice unwavering, "I will now enter into the record a series of documents obtained legally through federal channels and authenticated by the Department of Justice." There was no objection. There couldn't be. Even Judge Chen, now unnaturally still in his chair, didn't move to interrupt her. She held up a slim binder, its tab marked Exhibit A. "This includes logs of 7 private meetings between Your Honor and Mr. Maxwell Harrington, CEO of Gulfstream Dynamics, occurring at private residences, closed-door clubs, and 1 unlisted yacht in international waters off the Florida coast." The first page flipped onto the evidence card with a sharp slap, each entry time-stamped, GPS-tagged, and confirmed through subpoenaed cell tower triangulation. Each meeting took place within 72 hours of a major procedural ruling favorable to Gulfstream's interests. The courtroom was silent, not the quiet of confusion, the silence of disbelief sharpening into fear. She did not pause. She opened Exhibit B. Here are certified transaction records showing offshore wire transfers totaling $3.75 million over a span of 11 months. Each deposit traces back to holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and each routes, eventually, to an account under the name E.M. Chen Trust. A ripple moved through the gallery, not just audible, but physical, like a tremor underfoot. Even the prosecution turned, whispering frantically among themselves. "These transfers coincide precisely with Your Honor's suppression of defense motions in cases involving federal procurement contracts." She laid out printouts of the transactions, page by page, like setting down a trail of footprints leading straight to the bench. Then she opened Exhibit C. And finally, emails retrieved under warrant from Mr. Harrington's private server. One in particular, dated October 6th of last year, reads, and I quote, "The judge has assured me the outcome will be controlled. Everything is greenlit." She let the words hang. There was no need to dramatize them. The gallery, the jury, the clerk, even the walls seemed to recoil. In less than 4 minutes, the power dynamic that had ruled courtroom 4B all morning collapsed like scaffolding set on fire from the inside. Reporters typed with mechanical violence. A juror gasped audibly. The court sketch artist paused midline, stunned by the expression now frozen on Chen's face. Not rage, not denial, but something far more dangerous. Fear. Jasmine stood still. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't looked away. She had simply held up a mirror to corruption and let it reflect its own rot. For the first time in his career, Judge Edward Chen wasn't speaking. He wasn't ruling. He wasn't towering over anyone. He was exposed, and the entire courtroom could feel it. And as the final line of that email, "The judge has assured me the outcome will be controlled," reverberated through the air like a live wire. The silence that followed wasn't simply stunned. It was the kind of silence that falls right before a structure gives way. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of order, but a place hanging on the edge of collapse. It was Jasmine Crockett who stepped forward, her hands steady as she opened a narrow black case file marked only with the initials 23J, C789, and the insignia of the U.S. Department of Justice. The seal broke with a quiet snap, but the force behind it was enough to shake the walls of power in that room. She nodded once, and Agent Eliza Hart, now seated just behind the defense, rose from her bench and handed a supplemental affidavit to the court clerk. No one in the room had seen her move. She had been still as stone until this moment. The clerk, pale-faced, unfolded the document and delivered it to the bench. Chen took it with a hand that trembled, just barely, but enough that the gallery noticed. Jasmine's voice returned with precision. Your Honor, what has been presented so far, the meetings, the offshore transactions, the private correspondence, are not isolated findings. For the past 11 months, the Department of Justice, in coordination with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, has been conducting an active classified investigation into a pattern of judicial misconduct involving multiple federal rulings, with this bench at the center. She turned toward the projection monitor as Agent Hart keyed in the encrypted credentials. The screen lit up with a clean interface. FBI Digital Archive, verified assets. One by one, files appeared. Folders labeled wire transfers, audio surveillance, private email chains, call logs, shell corporations. These materials, Jasmine continued, have been authenticated by DOJ forensic auditors, voice verified through biometric analysis, and matched against financial records obtained by federal subpoena. Then came the sound, not a loud one. A soft click as Agent Hart played the first audio clip. Chen's voice emerged from the speakers, clear and unambiguous. Make sure the Harrington contract lands where it's supposed to. I don't want anything screwing this up. Another clip. Delay the motion. Stall it out. The longer the defense wobbles, the better this looks for us. The words weren't just damning. They were surgical strikes against the very foundation of his authority. Not speculation, not suggestion. His voice, his words, his intent. Jasmine didn't move, didn't speak. She let the recordings speak for themselves. Across the courtroom, the shift was immediate. Not whispered disbelief, but visceral reaction. A juror in the front row leaned back as if physically struck. Another turned her head slowly toward the bench, her eyes wide, filled with something close to horror. Even the prosecution table had fallen into complete silence, their lead counsel's pen still in his hand, frozen mid-note. No one was looking at Jasmine anymore. Every single person in that room, from the sketch artist to the bailiff, was staring at Edward Chen. But this time, they weren't seeing a judge. They weren't seeing a figure of law. They were seeing a man unraveling beneath the weight of his own fraud, exposed on the very stage he had once used to dominate others. And still, Jasmine stood, silent, collected, as if she had known from the beginning that this moment would come. And as the final clip of Chen's voice dissolved into the thick, electrified air, a man cloaked in authority openly manipulating the outcome of a federal trial, Jasmine Crockett did not hesitate. She stepped forward, her heels echoing on the marble floor like a war drum. The silence that met her words wasn't born of confusion. It was the kind of silence that precedes irreversible change. Your Honor, she said, standing tall with the DOJ case file still open on the desk beside her. In light of the overwhelming and authenticated evidence of misconduct, the defense formally moves to immediately suspend these proceedings under emergency grounds. The integrity of this courtroom has been compromised beyond recovery. Justice cannot proceed here. Not like this. She said it without flinching, without raising her voice. But the force of her words cut through the chambers like a judicial scalpel, slicing through decades of pretense. Before Judge Chen could even part his lips to respond, Special Agent Eliza Hart had already stepped into the aisle, signaling toward the gallery. The door swung open behind her, and through them came Lauren Vasquez, Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, her badge gleaming, her face expressionless. She walked past the stunned spectators, past the bench, and stood directly in front of the court. Per DOJ emergency oversight protocol, she began, her voice resonating with finality. Judge Edward Chen is hereby suspended from the bench, effective immediately, pending formal investigation and potential prosecution under the RICO Act. There was no gavel strike, no official acknowledgement, because the moment itself was louder than any sound could match. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Reporters scrambled to raise cameras. Members of the prosecution sat frozen, as if realizing too late that the ship they had boarded was now sinking. And Chen, the man who had spent the morning silencing others, sat utterly mute. His hands clenched the arms of his chair, his knuckles pale, the warrant envelope in his grip trembling slightly as if it carried the weight of his unraveling identity. Vasquez turned back to the gallery, her eyes sweeping over every set of stunned faces. This trial is suspended, effective immediately. All pending motions are void. A new judge will be assigned, and a full federal review of all rulings issued by Judge Chen over the past 5 years will commence within 48 hours. Not a sound followed. Not from the court staff, not from the media, not even from Chen himself. He had been reduced, not by outrage or revenge, but by the methodical, inescapable exposure of truth. For the first time since he entered the courtroom that morning, Judge Edward Chen was no longer presiding over anything. He wasn't feared. He wasn't revered. He was watched, not with respect, but with scrutiny. And Jasmine Crockett, the woman he had tried to belittle, now stood at the very center of a reckoning that would echo through every marble hall in the federal system. And as the final syllables of Deputy Director Vasquez's declaration echoed into stunned silence, the courtroom no longer felt like a judicial chamber. It felt like ground zero. Just outside, chaos detonated. The courthouse plaza, moments earlier subdued under the weight of heat and ritual, had become a media war zone. Satellite vans from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and global outlets like BBC and Al Jazeera lined the curb like tanks. Cameramen shoved tripods into position as producers barked into earpieces. Reporters shouted questions into microphones even though they had no one to direct them at yet. Anchors were already live, their tones breathless. In an unprecedented development, a federal judge has been suspended mid-trial under corruption allegations. The front steps of the courthouse were cordoned off by U.S. Marshals, but that didn't stop the crowd. Protesters, lawyers, journalists, law students, all surged forward, phones raised, lenses zoomed, chasing even a glimpse of anyone coming out of courtroom 4B. Inside, the impact rippled in quieter, more dangerous ways. The prosecution table, just hours ago smug and dominant, now looked like a pile of ash in tailored suits. One junior prosecutor whispered nervously to her supervisor, who didn't respond, just stared straight ahead like someone watching his reflection dissolve in acid. Moments later, 2 senior prosecutors approached Deputy Director Vasquez in the side aisle. Their voices were low but urgent. Jasmine could only make out fragments, previous rulings, sealed motions, potential conflicts. They weren't just reacting. They were trying to preempt something, cover a trail, untangle themselves. The spectacle wasn't just destroying one judge. It was exposing a rot that had tentacled into more than one set of hands. The fear on their faces wasn't theatrical. It was survival instinct. And still, Jasmine Crockett stood where she had all along, motionless behind her table, hands resting calmly on the DOJ evidence folder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The thunder she'd unleashed was still rolling through the marble bones of the courthouse, and now for once, it wasn't just her feeling the tremor. For years, she had sat in courtrooms like this, spoken truth into rooms that silenced her, cited law to men who pretended not to hear, stood her ground while power draped itself in condescension and robes. She had been labeled too loud, too emotional, too ambitious. Today, she said nothing, and the silence carried her voice farther than any firestorm ever had. In the jury box, the air was still heavy, but something shifted, something personal. Juror number 6, an older black woman with white hair pulled back into a low bun and a notepad filled with meticulous cursive, looked up from the chaos and locked eyes with Jasmine. No smile, no words, just a slow, deliberate nod. The kind that says, I saw everything, I felt it too, and I know what it cost you to survive it. Jasmine met her gaze without blinking. For a second, time stilled. In that unspoken exchange, there was recognition, solidarity, and quiet, righteous fury, not at what had happened in this courtroom today, but at the truth that it had taken this long to happen at all. In the hallway, echoes of shouted headlines bounced off the walls. Federal judge suspended. Live update. Courtroom 4B. Did DOJ act too late? Was this just the tip of a deeper scandal? Microphones angled toward anyone exiting the chamber doors. Even the court sketch artist was surrounded by reporters demanding glimpses of her drawings. Rough images of Jasmine standing firm, Chen collapsing into silence, Vasquez flanked by agents. A security officer announced a full building lockdown for the next hour. The corridors of justice had become a spectacle, and for once the cameras weren't there to reduce a woman like Jasmine to caricature. They were there to witness the blow she had struck, and still she hadn't moved. Not really. She gathered her materials with careful precision, one page at a time, like someone packing away evidence of a war crime. Reuben Glass stood beside her now, silent, not smiling, but vibrating with something close to awe. He didn't speak either. He didn't have to. Every member of that defense team knew they had crossed into a moment that would be studied in law schools, cited in oversight hearings, whispered about in judges' chambers across the country. They didn't just challenge the bench, they put it on trial, and it broke. Somewhere behind her, a clerk's voice wavered into the microphone. "This courtroom is now adjourned until further notice." But the words barely registered, because everyone inside already knew this courtroom wasn't coming back. Not in the form it once held, not with the same reverence. Something had been exposed, and exposure rewrites the rules. In the span of an afternoon, a judge was unseated, a trial was suspended, a power structure was cracked at its root, and at the center of it all stood the woman the system had once tried to underestimate. The thunder outside grew louder, reporters now calling her name. "Congresswoman Crockett." "Ms. Crockett, what happens next? Did you expect the judge to fall like this?" But Jasmine didn't answer. She hadn't come to perform. She had come to reveal, and she had done exactly that. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was the first real shift in a system built to resist change. And for the first time in years, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel like she was standing on someone else's ground. She felt the marble beneath her feet shake and knew the tremor had come from her own steps. And while the tremors of Jasmine Crockett's revelations still rippled through the courthouse walls, something more chilling unfolded. Not with sirens or shouting, but with a slow, suffocating quiet. In that stillness, Judge Edward Chen, once the sovereign of courtroom 4B, found himself standing not as the final authority, but as the solitary shadow of a man whose kingdom had collapsed in real time. He was not escorted. He was not restrained. No cuffs glinted on his wrists. No agents flanked his side. And yet, in every sense that mattered, Edward Chen was now a prisoner inside his own courtroom. Where once his voice had cracked the air like a whip, now not even the sound of his breath commanded attention. No one looked directly at him. Not the jury, not the clerks, not even the bailiff who had stood sharply at his side just hours earlier. The same people who once rose when he entered now pretended not to see him, as if looking at him too long might invite guilt by association. The bench behind which he had loomed for years now towered above him in silence, cold and distant. His gavel sat untouched, a dull, impotent relic of a power that had evaporated without ceremony. He glanced at it briefly, perhaps instinctively, but didn't reach for it. What would have once been the instrument of control now looked like a prop from a play whose audience had already left. When the DOJ agents entered, they didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't even need to approach him. It was his own judicial assistant, Michael Sloan, a man who had carried Chen's briefcase into courtrooms for the past 6 years, who delivered the blow. He approached the bench slowly, stiff with the discomfort of betrayal wrapped in protocol. "Judge Chen," Sloan said quietly, eyes never fully lifting from the ground, "the Department of Justice has requested to conduct a preliminary statement with you, in your chambers, privately." The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning wasn't lost on anyone in the room. It was no request. It was the start of a dismantling. Chen didn't speak. He didn't protest. He only nodded once, not as a judge giving permission, but as a man surrendering the last piece of illusion he had. For a brief moment, he adjusted the sleeve of his robe, smoothing the fabric out with trembling fingers. But no gesture of control, no folding of cloth, no posture could undo what had just been revealed. As he stepped down from the bench, the difference in his gait was stark. The confident, deliberate march that had carried him through thousands of hearings was gone. In its place was a fragile, almost uncertain shuffle. His shoes, once polished to a judicial gleam, scuffed softly against the marble floor, like they were carrying not just his weight, but the collapsing scaffolding of his legacy. He passed the defense table slowly. Reuben Glass shifted slightly in place, but Jasmine remained perfectly still. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her silence now was louder than any speech. It was not vengeance that held her still. It was resolve. She had done what generations of attorneys before her had tried and failed to do. Bring a robed tyrant to his knees not with emotion, but with evidence. Chen didn't glance at her either. He couldn't. To look at her now was to face the unbearable, not just exposure, but defeat, and not at the hands of a system, but at the hands of a woman he had spent the day trying to humiliate. Every step toward the side door stretched like a slow funeral march. Only this time, the casket held not a body, but a career. As the door creaked open, a sound that felt indecent in its intimacy, everyone in the courtroom turned slightly, not to see where he was going, but to confirm what had happened. That the man who had once ruled this room with smirking contempt now had to be asked to leave it. Chen crossed the threshold, the door closed behind him with a soft but final click. And just like that, he was gone. But his absence didn't erase him. It exposed him. A silence lingered, thick, awkward, oppressive. Not the kind that invited reflection, but the kind that pressed on every chest like a slow-building pressure system. No one spoke. Even the court reporter's hands had gone still, resting beside her stenotype like they too had nothing left to record. The bailiff, arms usually crossed in silent authority, now stood with hands at his sides, eyes lowered. On the prosecution side, files were being quietly gathered, but no one dared make eye contact. It was as if they were cleaning up a crime scene, not finishing a trial. Outside, through the small rectangular windows set high along the back wall, reporters swarmed like hornets in the Florida sun. Flashes popped every few seconds. Microphones stretched upward toward the courthouse's steps, like a forest of hungry arms. But inside, the heat came from something else entirely. The recognition that power had changed hands, and that everyone in that room had witnessed a moment that would outlive them all. In the front row of the gallery, a woman slowly reached into her purse and pulled out a notepad she hadn't touched since the opening statements. She wrote one line, folded the paper in half, and clutched it to her chest. On the jury bench, juror number 6, the older woman who had watched every exchange with a kind of knowing restraint, closed her notepad, laid her hands across it, and turned ever so slightly toward Jasmine. And there it was, the nod. Not one of approval, not even of praise, but of recognition. A silent communion. The kind of gesture that only exists between women who have endured the quiet cruelty of being dismissed, then dared to rise anyway. And Jasmine, for her part, received it without a smile, without words. Her expression didn't change, but in her stillness, there was the quiet of a reckoning. She had not raised her voice all day. She hadn't slammed her fist. She hadn't demanded justice. She had simply brought it, piece by piece, document by document, until there was nowhere left for injustice to hide. And now, standing in the hushed remnants of the courtroom, she didn't appear triumphant. She appeared undeniable. Every camera outside was pointed toward the hallway where Chen would eventually exit. But no one in that hallway would see what the courtroom had just witnessed. A man who had once walked like a king now moved like a question with no answer. Inside his private chambers, the DOJ agents waited. No cuffs, no spotlight, just a table, a recorder, and a list of questions that would unthread the rest of his career thread by thread. But none of that mattered here. What mattered was that the robe no longer protected him. The bench no longer elevated him. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. He was not in handcuffs, but he was caged. Not by bars, but by truth, by exposure, by the irreversible weight of being seen not as a judge, but as a man who believed he was above judgment. And in that most poetic twist of fate, it wasn't the system that punished him. It was the very system he thought he could manipulate, finally operating as it should in the hands of someone who refused to let it fail. And as Judge Edward Chen disappeared behind the side door into the custody of the very justice system he had twisted to his advantage, The emotional gravity inside courtroom 4B didn't subside. It deepened, sharpened, and shifted its focus. The storm had passed, yes, but in its wake, there stood only one figure left unshaken, not because she had escaped the blast, but because she had lit the fuse herself. Deputy Director Vasquez, standing near the defense table, took 2 steps toward the gallery and turned to face the remaining court staff, jurors, and DOJ observers. Her words were clear and intentional, spoken not as a statement of record, but as a correction to history. "Let it be known," she said, voice firm and echoing in the silence Chen had once filled, "that this investigation did not begin at random. It did not begin because of a whistleblower in a distant agency. It began because Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, as private counsel in this case, submitted a sealed, corroborated intelligence packet to our office 4 months ago. She gathered it piece by piece, case by case, motion by motion, and she did so without public spectacle, without leaks, and at significant professional risk." That moment landed harder than any gavel ever could. Gasps didn't follow. Only the kind of reverent quiet that often precedes a standing ovation, though this courtroom wasn't built for applause. It wasn't happenstance. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a last-minute miracle caught on tape. It was deliberate architecture, a legal siege designed in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when no one was watching, no one was recording, and no one believed it would work. Jasmine hadn't exposed a corrupt judge by accident. She had built the scaffolding herself, carried the weight alone, and planted every explosive with care, and then simply waited for the man in the robe to strike the match. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. As Vasquez returned to the DOJ officials in the gallery, Jasmine remained exactly where she was, standing with one hand resting lightly on her briefcase, the other gripping a legal pad she no longer needed. Reuben leaned toward her, whispering something, a question maybe, or an offer to speak to the press. But she shook her head slowly. Her gaze was distant now, not out of detachment, but out of clarity. The courtroom was no longer a battlefield. It was a crater, and the mission was complete. Outside the chamber doors, dozens of reporters waited, microphones in hand, shouting her name as if they had known her the whole time. They hadn't. Hours ago, they had barely noticed when she walked into the building. Hours ago, they had eyes only for the man in the robe and the spectacle they expected him to command. But now the narrative had flipped, and the world was hungry for a quote. Something to put on headlines, on tweets, on breaking news banners flashing across television screens. She walked out slowly, flanked by her legal team, her face unreadable beneath the glow of camera flashes and shouts. "Ms. Crockett, how long have you known about the corruption? Congresswoman, will you be pressing for criminal charges? Is this the beginning of a broader investigation?" She kept walking, her heels steady against the concrete, her silhouette razor-sharp beneath the courthouse lights. There were no bodyguards, no podium, no teleprompter. Just a woman who had stared down a judicial monster and didn't blink. At the top of the courthouse steps, she paused. She turned not to the cameras but to the cluster of young interns standing behind the press line. Law students, aides, interns from both political parties who had watched the hearing unfold like a trial out of myth. Her eyes scanned them slowly, and then she spoke. Only once. "Not everyone who holds the gavel," she said, her voice low but unmistakable, "is a guardian of justice." Then she turned back to the courthouse, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the crowd. That sentence would be quoted in every newspaper by nightfall. It would be printed on posters, tweeted by pundits, carved into protest signs. Law professors would assign it as required reading. Politicians would misquote it to fit their own narratives. But in that moment, raw and unfiltered, it wasn't a statement for history. It was a verdict. Not against one man, but against a system that had for too long mistaken performance for principle and silence for consent. Back inside, the courtroom remained open but inert, the bench empty, the gavel untouched, the flags still, as if even they were waiting to see what would happen next. And maybe that was the point. Justice hadn't come from the seal above the bench or the marble beneath their feet. It hadn't come from title or tenure or procedural authority. It had come from preparation, precision, and patience. and from one woman's refusal to let misconduct go unchallenged simply because it wore a robe. For 4 months, Jasmine Crockett had worked in shadows, assembling pieces no one else had bothered to see, interviewing former clerks off the record, digging into corporate filings hidden behind offshore shells, tracking campaign donations that matched suspicious court rulings down to the week. Each night she stayed late in a windowless office, each email thread she decrypted, each subpoena she quietly convinced a magistrate to approve. They had all led here. And now, standing beneath the vaulted sky of a courthouse that would never forget her name, she let the work speak for itself. No shouting, no revenge, no celebration. Just the cold, unstoppable forward motion of truth, brought to bear by someone who never needed to scream to be heard. Not everyone who holds the gavel is a guardian of justice, but sometimes the guardian walks in from the outside and breaks the gavel in half. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words vanished into the roar of news anchors and camera flashes, the echo of her quiet rebellion continued to fracture the very foundations of the federal judiciary. The trial may have ended, the courtroom emptied, the gavel silenced, but the shockwaves were just beginning to hit Washington. What happened in courtroom 4B was no longer viewed as an isolated scandal. It was the trigger, the lightning bolt that illuminated the silhouette of a much darker storm. Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice issued a classified internal memo to top-level officials across multiple branches. A directive marked Interagency Priority Review. Its title was blunt, the kind that didn't require nuance. Judicial Corporate Financial Entanglement, Phase 1 Review Targets. The contents? Explosive. The DOJ confirmed what many feared but never dared say aloud, that the corruption exposed in the case of Judge Edward Chen may only be the first breach in a dam of hidden transactions, corporate favors, and judicial backroom dealings that had remained buried for years beneath layers of procedural immunity. This wasn't just a corruption inquiry. It was a structural audit of the American legal system's highest floors, and it would shake the towers of power in ways no election, no leak, and no scandal had done before. The investigation, codenamed Operation Threshold, was launched under the joint command of the DOJ's Public Integrity Section, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and the Office of the Inspector General. At its core was a single, chilling premise: how many federal judges had become silent partners in corporate empires? Within days, agents began freezing travel records, issuing broad subpoenas to subpoena-resistant third parties, and securing emergency warrants for sealed banking documents tied to judicial trusts and family foundations. The targets weren't just judges. They were their clerks, their assistants, their former law firms, and, most explosively, the corporate legal departments of Fortune 500 defense contractors, fossil fuel conglomerates, and AI development firms with cases pending in federal courts. Emails once considered untouchable under judicial privilege were quietly reclassified. Shell corporations registered in Malta, Singapore, the British Virgin Islands, all suddenly found their encryption pierced by court orders signed by special panels working under DOJ jurisdiction. And at the center of it all, visible only to those tracking the investigation's origin, was the name Crockett. The media's frenzy over Chen's suspension quickly morphed into something darker, more urgent. Late-night segments ran side-by-side photos of judges and CEOs at charity galas, hunting lodges, and undisclosed retreats. A spreadsheet leaked to a major news outlet showed a pattern too consistent to ignore: 38 federal rulings in the past decade that benefited 6 corporations disproportionately, all handed down by judges with overlapping investments or undisclosed family ties to those very corporations. Suddenly, the term judicial independence no longer inspired confidence. It provoked suspicion. For Jasmine, the aftermath was not vindication. It was confirmation of a suspicion she had carried alone for years. She had argued cases where defense motions vanished from the docket. She had watched prosecutors breeze through evidentiary hurdles that should have stopped them cold. She had stood in silent courtrooms where glares replaced due process. What she unearthed in Chen's case wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint, a behavioral pattern that extended beyond one courtroom, beyond one city, beyond even one ideology. She had once been ridiculed for pressing too hard on financial disclosures, called paranoid for suggesting judges should be subject to the same scrutiny as elected officials, told to sit down when questioning the overlap between campaign donations and case outcomes. But now, the same legal scholars who once dismissed her concerns were publishing op-eds in The Atlantic titled, "Was Jasmine Crockett Right All Along?" And while she made no public appearances in the days that followed, her silence only amplified the weight of her role. DOJ spokespeople didn't dare downplay her contributions. In fact, Deputy Director Vasquez was quoted directly, "The investigation would not exist without her. This is not just about one corrupt judge. It's about a judiciary that has gone unexamined for too long." Capitol Hill responded with characteristic panic. Senate Judiciary Committee members demanded closed-door briefings. Internal compliance divisions at major firms ordered immediate reviews of all legal partnerships. A classified subcommittee was hastily formed to review whether judicial lifetime appointments should be amended to allow for mid-career audits, a move considered political suicide only months earlier. Now a mainstream talking point. Whispers of impeachment inquiries began to swirl, not for the usual reasons, but for silence, for complicity, for trading access to legal leniency in exchange for corporate privilege. Still, the question lingered like a match held over dry paper. How deep did it go? A federal intelligence analyst leaked a redacted map to a major investigative outlet. It outlined suspected nodes in what one internal memo labeled a judicial influence network. There were names, not revealed publicly, but known behind closed doors. Judges in New York, Los Angeles, Houston. Corporate board members with prior careers in federal litigation. Offshore accounts with traceable backdoors to retirement trusts. One line in the map had a label that sent chills through every agency that read it. "The bench is not blind, it's bought." Inside the DOJ's operations center, Jasmine's original packet of evidence remained under secure lock and biometric access. Investigators treated it as both blueprint and warning. This was the level of work required to crack the door open. The Crockett dossier, as it came to be known in internal circles, wasn't just documentation. It was proof that one woman, working without institutional power, had exposed what layers of oversight had failed to see, or perhaps had chosen not to. Reporters camped outside her home. Her team fielded over 200 interview requests in 3 days. But Jasmine refused to speak. She had no interest in being a celebrity. She didn't need her name in lights. She wanted change. Measurable, systemic, irreversible change. And for the first time in her career, she could feel it. Not just in articles, not just in legislation, but in the tremor under the feet of those who had believed their robes made them untouchable. Justice had been tested, and for once it didn't break. It bent, it trembled, but it held, and only because someone outside the circle had been willing to challenge its sacred illusion. As a second DOJ task force formed, this one aimed at developing a national database of judge corporate financial overlaps, the headlines grew bolder. The Crockett effect. The gavel cracks. Justice audited. But Jasmine, even in her silence, remained unmoved by praise. She knew too well what it had cost to reach this moment. 4 months of coded emails, encrypted drives, sleepless nights. 4 months of being doubted, gaslit, and warned that pushing too far would destroy her career. But she had pushed anyway, because the damage was already there. The only question was whether anyone would name it. Now it was named. Now it was real. And now it was burning its way through the federal system like sunlight hitting dry leaves. The courtroom had emptied. The cameras had moved on. But in the secure back rooms of the Justice Department, the real reckoning had just begun. And it had Jasmine Crockett's signature written all over it. And as the DOJ's interagency investigation thundered forward like a blade through velvet, Jasmine Crockett's name rose above the noise. Not as a partisan lightning rod, not as a rising star, but as the embodiment of moral force inside a crumbling system. Her silence was now louder than anyone else's words, and Washington, for once, had the sense to listen. The official invitation arrived at dawn, sealed, hand-delivered, and bearing the full weight of institutional urgency. It was not merely symbolic, it was a concession, a quiet admittance that the system she once stood outside of, questioning with righteous fury, now needed her to help save it from itself. The Judicial Ethics Committee, long regarded as ceremonial and toothless, extended its most serious ask in decades. Jasmine was requested to serve as special counsel to the Federal Judicial Conduct Oversight Board. Not tomorrow, not pending approval, immediately. No podium, no press conference, no boastful soundbite. Just her name in bold black ink and a nation holding its breath. She didn't answer the letter with words. She answered it with action. That morning, as Capitol Hill buzzed with reporters and congressional aides refreshing their feeds by the second, one image began to dominate timelines and airwaves alike. It wasn't a shot of courtroom chaos or Chen's unraveling. It was Jasmine, caught mid-turn, standing at the defense table in that fateful hearing. Her eyes were leveled, her shoulders squared, not in triumph, but in defiance. One hand on a binder, the other clenched at her side. Behind her, the chaos of a collapsing courtroom. But in that frame, she looked like the only fixed point in a spinning world. The photo flooded social media with a caption that didn't scream, but whispered with weight. Not a victor, a storm anchor. From Harvard Law to Howard University, classrooms paused lectures to break down her tactics, her composure, her legal mastery. Overnight, students were quoting her opening statements in moot court competitions. Seasoned prosecutors re-examined past rulings where her voice had once been dismissed. Entire podcasts were devoted to one question: how did she see it coming when no one else did? And the answer kept echoing in every corner of legal commentary, because she never stopped watching the system, even when it refused to watch her. When Jasmine entered the vaulted chamber of the Judicial Ethics Committee for her first closed session, she didn't wait to be introduced. She stepped forward, opened her binder, and began. "There's no point in pretending this committee still holds the public's trust," she said, eyes scanning a room full of judges, senators, legal clerks, and ethics officers. "Trust isn't granted by title. It's earned by action. And right now, the American people are watching this room to see if we're ready to act, or just continue performing." Silence fell. A different kind of silence. The kind that came not from protocol, but from discomfort. Because truth has a sound when it hits too hard to ignore. Her demands weren't radical. They were surgical. Mandatory financial disclosure audits for all Article 3 judges, quarterly ethics reviews, not yearly ones, public registries of judicial-sponsored trips, corporate gifts, and affiliated nonprofit donations. And above all, enforcement teeth. Penalties, disqualification clauses, real consequences. No more warnings. No more wrist slaps disguised as reprimands. The days of robes shielding rot were over. She laid it out like a prosecutor preparing her closing argument. But there was no fury in her tone. Just clarity, razor sharp, impossible to deny. Even those who had once mocked her as too emotional or too aggressive now leaned in with a mixture of admiration and unease. Because it was clear that Jasmine wasn't appealing for reform. She was dragging the system toward it, whether it was ready or not. Outside the room, the response was immediate. Journalists called it the Crockett Doctrine. Advocacy groups released statements of support within hours. Federal law clerks across the country whispered to each other in elevators and back rooms, "She's changing the code in real time." But Jasmine didn't care about headlines. She didn't even watch the coverage. When asked by a junior staffer if she wanted to approve her own press release, she said simply, "Let the work speak," and walked on. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, young attorneys pinned her photo above their desks, not because she won, but because she stood in the storm, in the fire, in the space where so many had folded or fled. That evening, as the committee recessed, a camera captured one last frame. Jasmine walking down a marble hallway, the gold-banded binder still in her hands, heels echoing with every step. She didn't wave. She didn't look up. But the camera caught her reflection in the polished floor, and in it, she looked like something more than a lawyer or a lawmaker. She looked like the reckoning the system had never prepared for. And across a nation still reeling, still reckoning, still questioning whether justice was real or just another costume for power, one truth stood clear. The gavel no longer belonged to the judge. It belonged to the woman who dared to question why it ever had. And as the headlines faded and the cameras moved on to newer crises, what remained wasn't the scandal or the viral moment or even the procedural reforms. What remained was something deeper, something quiet and uncomfortable and necessary. In the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with power, a question began to haunt every chamber of law, every boardroom, every civic hall across the country. How many systems have we mistaken for justice, simply because they wore the right clothes and spoke the right words? This wasn't just about a single corrupt judge. It was about the invisible architecture that allowed men like Edward Chen to rise, unchecked, to the highest platforms of authority. It was about how respectability became a disguise, how titles became armor, and how too often we confuse power with integrity. Jasmine had cracked open more than a courtroom. She had cracked open the illusion that justice is guaranteed simply by process. Her battle revealed that fairness is not built into the walls of institutions. It is carried, one person at a time, by those courageous enough to call the institution's bluff. For every moment Jasmine was interrupted, disrespected, condescended to, she didn't just endure. She remembered, she wrote it down. She turned every slight into a data point, every dismissal into ammunition. And when the time came, she didn't respond with fury. She responded with precision. That is the true cost of change. Not just passion, but restraint. Not just outrage, but strategy. And that is what shook the nation to its core. Not that a woman had stood up to a corrupt man in robes, but that she did it without becoming what she was fighting. The human lesson lies in that tension, in the tightrope between silence and noise. Jasmine taught us that sometimes the most radical act is not to shout louder, but to prepare longer. Not to destroy everything, but to choose which pillar to strike so the whole rot falls in one clean motion. She didn't humiliate her enemy. She revealed him. She didn't burn down the courtroom. She changed who it served. And in doing so, she reminded the world of something dangerously forgotten in the modern age of spectacle. Justice is not the performance of virtue. It is the discipline of truth. It is slow, grueling, thankless work. It requires listening more than speaking, gathering more than reacting, and standing firm when everyone else has fled. Jasmine did not emerge from this story unscarred, but that's what made her triumph matter. It was not gifted to her. It was earned with bruises no camera ever caught. So the lesson, in the end, is not about Jasmine Crockett alone. It is about everyone watching, everyone reading, everyone asking what they would do in that room, under those lights facing that kind of pressure. The real transformation wasn't just in the system she exposed. It was in the quiet awakening of people who realize they too have a choice. To stay silent, or to prepare, to play along, or to anchor themselves in the storm. And perhaps that's the most human truth of all. Sometimes the bravest people are the ones who speak least, until it matters most. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. At a nationally televised CNN town hall in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts Kash Patel in a fiery clash over government secrecy and national security ethics. Patel strikes first, loud, relentless, questioning her qualifications and trying to paint her as out of her depth. But just minutes later, Crockett calmly reaches for a sealed folder and reveals something that flips the entire narrative on live television. What truth did she unleash that left Patel cornered, careers trembling, and America holding its breath? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio lights flared like floodlights on a battlefield. The CNN town hall stage gleamed in red, white, and steel gray. A polished arena built for ideological combat, not discussion. The crowd was already restless before the cameras rolled, murmurs rippling like a rising tide through the auditorium. At center stage, Kash Patel adjusted his cufflinks with the smirk of a man who believed he owned the air he breathed. "Let's be honest," he said, cutting through the room like a blade. Jasmine Crockett is a textbook case of what happens when social media stardom is mistaken for national security expertise. A sharp inhale rippled across the audience. Not surprise, but the thrill of a shot fired in cold blood. She's loud, she's flashy, but let's not pretend that qualifies someone to weigh in on matters that involve classified intelligence or life and death decisions. The words weren't just pointed, they were loaded, designed to detonate. On screen, his face was calm. In the room, the tension was already crackling like dry air before a storm. The audience reacted like a fractured mirror. On one side, a wave of applause and cheers erupted from the conservative section, fists pumping, smug nods exchanged like currency. But on the other, there was a different sound. Sharp exhales, narrowed eyes, and the unmistakable silence of people who'd just been insulted by proxy. Patel's posture was military clean, his delivery crisp like a man trained to dominate boardrooms and battlefields alike. "We are living in dangerous times," he said, pacing slightly, voice rising. "And the last thing we need is a performative, progressive treating defense policy like a TikTok debate." A few audience members laughed uncomfortably. Others folded their arms tighter. This wasn't just an attack. It was an ambush masked as commentary. And the woman he was targeting hadn't even stepped onto the stage yet. That silence, it wasn't absence. It was the calm before something seismic. But as the last echo of Patel's smug words faded into the heat of the studio lights, a new energy stirred behind the curtain. Steady, unshaken, and entirely unbothered by the noise outside. The announcer's voice sliced through the room. "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." A single spotlight swung to stage left, and she stepped into it like a blade sliding from its sheath. No smile, no wave. Just poise wrapped in deep blue fabric and a gaze that could cut marble. Her stride was slow but deliberate, the walk of someone who didn't need to speak loudly because her presence was already doing the talking. In her left hand, a black leather folder, clean, precise, and sealed like a classified vault. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a warning. She placed it on the table with a soft thud that felt louder than any applause. And for the first time all night, Patel stopped moving. Crockett took her seat with elegance, adjusting her mic with surgical precision. She didn't fidget, didn't break eye contact with the moderator, or with Patel. Her body language was a masterclass in silent command, upright, unmoved, calm like a storm about to speak. Around her, the tension bent inward, like gravity itself had shifted. The crowd fell quiet, not out of respect, but because they sensed something they didn't expect. She hadn't come to defend herself from Patel's ridicule. She had come to indict it. And that black folder sitting next to her on the desk? It wasn't a defense. It was evidence. Loaded, locked, waiting. But just as Jasmine Crockett settled into her seat, composed, dignified, radiating a storm restrained, Kash Patel lunged forward like a man afraid of silence, hurling interruption after interruption, as if her voice itself was a threat he couldn't afford to let breathe. He didn't wait. He didn't blink. Before Crockett could fully tighten her mic or even part her lips, Patel was already hammering the table with his words. "Tell us, Congresswoman," he said, voice laced with condescension, so sharp it could draw blood. "What was your last direct intelligence briefing on a live threat vector? Not summaries, not filtered reports. I'm talking classified, real-time protocol decision-making." The aggression wasn't veiled. It was blatant. A blitz meant not to debate, but to dominate. He didn't give her time to answer. Didn't even pause for breath. "You want to sit at this table like you're an equal, but you've never even been in the war room, have you? You've never had to carry the weight of real-time American lives on your shoulders. You've had cameras, tweets, and hashtags, not enemies and deadlines." Laughter rose from his side of the room, but it wasn't the kind that echoed confidence. It was desperate, insecure, the kind that needed volume to hide fear. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look away. But behind her stillness was a different kind of fire. Not reaction, but readiness. Chris Wallace, the evening's moderator and veteran CNN anchor, leaned forward like a referee forced to call a foul no one else dared blow the whistle on. "Mr. Patel, please." Let her speak. His tone was firm, but Patel dismissed it with a tight shrug and the smugness of a man who believed rules were for the weaker player. The audience deserves clarity, Chris, Patel declared, his voice rising like a prosecutor delivering a final blow. Not rhetorical gymnastics, not moral grandstanding, clarity. And that doesn't come from someone who's never held a national security clearance. The camera cut to Crockett. Her face was motionless, jaw set, but her hand twitched, just barely, near the corner of the folder. Not yet, not now. She was letting him dig. The audience was shifting. Some clapped again, others now whispered to each other, discomfort crawling across the front rows like a quiet storm. Wallace interjected again, this time louder, voice edged with authority. Mr. Patel, I've asked you to allow a response. She will have her time. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but Patel pressed forward anyway, unable to stop himself. This isn't about political correctness. This is about national security. And frankly, he said, leaning toward Crockett with a smirk that masked the panic under his skin, you are out of your depth. His words dropped like anvils, not to persuade, but to bury. And in doing so, he revealed his fear, that facts once spoken would render his performance meaningless. Crockett blinked slowly, not shaken, not silenced, just watching, calculating, storing every word like a fuse she intended to light when the moment demanded detonation. And just as Patel opened his mouth to strike again, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, not in outrage, not in defense, but with the unshakable calm of someone who had brought a loaded dossier to a knife fight. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply placed her palm flat on the black folder beside her, as if grounding the conversation in something heavier than ego, something unshakable. Let's start here, she said, her voice clear but measured, like the opening line of a cross-examination. Oversight is not a talking point. It's not a campaign slogan. It is the constitutional responsibility of this body, of me as an elected member of Congress, to ensure that those entrusted with power do not abuse it. Her eyes locked on Patel like a surgeon about to make the first incision. That responsibility includes national security, Mr. Patel, which means that your attempt to reframe me as an outsider, it's not just disrespectful, it's factually wrong. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Not applause, not yet, but the stir of people realizing the momentum was shifting. Slowly, deliberately, Crockett opened the folder. The sound of the clasp unlocking was barely audible, but somehow it echoed. She lifted a document from the folder, its top stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense, its text dense, its authority unmistakable. You've spoken about who's qualified, who's experienced, who belongs at this table, she said. So let's talk about qualifications. Not mine, but yours. With a subtle nod, she signaled the production crew. Instantly, the massive screen behind them flickered to life, replacing abstract rhetoric with something no one could shout over. An official Inspector General report, projected larger than life. The room went still. This is from June 2022, Crockett said, her voice as steady as a scalpel. Page 47, paragraph 3. It names you, Mr. Patel, directly. She paused, not for effect, but to let the truth take oxygen. The report outlines multiple breaches of protocol regarding classified material, including unauthorized disclosures and circumventing secure communication systems. For the first time all night, Patel didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. He didn't speak. His jaw clenched slightly, his shoulders pulled back as if bracing for impact. But the blow had already landed. Crockett continued, not gloating, not emotional, but with the quiet devastation of someone who had done the work. These aren't rumors. They're not headlines. They are findings from the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. She glanced briefly at Wallace, then back to Patel. You questioned my qualifications while sitting on a record like this? The audience was silent, motionless, caught between awe and disbelief. And Patel, who had moments earlier flooded the room with noise, now looked smaller under the studio lights, his authority flickering like a candle in wind. Jasmine hadn't just answered his attack. She had dismantled the premise behind it. But Crockett wasn't finished. What she had laid out so far wasn't the climax. It was just the scaffolding. The real weight, the part that would collapse Patel's composure entirely, was still in her hands. And she was just getting started. Jasmine Crockett lowered the first report gently onto the desk in front of her, then reached for a second document. Thicker, annotated and corner creased like it had been read many times under hard light. "Let me draw your attention to what followed those security violations," she said, her tone still level but infused now with undertow. "A current building, just beneath the calm. Because patterns tell us more than isolated moments ever can." She lifted the packet. "This is a series of internal communications between senior staffers at the Department of Defense. Emails dated within 48 hours of the first breach being flagged." The studio lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind them flickered, displaying a cropped email chain. Portions were redacted, but enough was visible to tell a story, one of fast, suspicious personnel movements. "As you'll see here," she said, laser pointing a section mid-thread, "2 employees who flagged protocol violations were reassigned within 2 days, with no formal justification on record. Their supervisors weren't informed. Their roles weren't backfilled." She paused, not theatrically but methodically, giving the audience just enough time to absorb the implication. Patel's posture had changed. He leaned back in his chair now, no longer prowling the conversation like a predator. His arms were crossed, but too tightly. His lips were pressed, but twitching. "Now," Crockett continued, flipping one more page, "let's pair that with this." She held up a signed affidavit. "Sworn testimony from James Keller, former Deputy Director of Operations, submitted to the House Oversight Committee in March of this year. And in it," she looked directly at Patel, "he claims that 3 days after the initial violations were documented, you held a closed-door meeting with senior staff. And in that meeting, Mr. Keller states under oath, you said, quote, 'We need to clean house of anyone who doesn't understand how things work now.'" The line hit the audience like a gunshot muffled by carpet. No immediate noise, but everyone felt it. On the screen, the quote appeared in bold font, beneath Keller's notarized signature. The air in the room flattened, like oxygen had been quietly siphoned out. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not outrage, not yet, but the tightening stillness of people realizing they were watching something irreversible. Patel's jaw moved, but no words came out at first. His hands flexed on the table, as if itching for control he no longer had. Finally he spoke, but the mask was gone. "That's a fabrication," he hissed, eyes narrowed. "That meeting had nothing to do with whistleblowers. Keller had an axe to grind, and you know it." He turned to the moderator. "Chris, this is insane. She's turning standard personnel decisions into some conspiracy." But even Chris Wallace, a seasoned anchor known for navigating shouting matches and partisan meltdowns, didn't interject. His silence spoke volumes, and Crockett, sensing the weakening of Patel's center, pressed forward, not with speed, but with precision. "Mr. Patel," she said, tone never rising, "you've stood here lecturing me about what it means to understand national security. You've questioned my qualifications, my experience, and my integrity, all while sitting on documented evidence that shows retaliatory behavior, procedural violations, and a disturbing pattern of deflecting blame." Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. Her body language was surgical. "If what I've presented is fabricated, perhaps you'd like to explain why these records were never challenged in committee, or why the Defense Department has yet to issue any retraction." That was the line that broke him. "This is a goddamn setup," Patel snapped, slamming his palm against the table. His voice cracked, raw now, stripped of its usual swagger. "You're twisting facts and spinning narratives like some kind of partisan hitwoman. These are internal matters, classified personnel shifts. You don't know what you're talking about." He gestured wildly, no longer controlled, no longer precise. "You've got an agenda, Congresswoman. That's all this is." And yet the more he spoke, the less the room moved with him. Where earlier he had rallied laughter and applause, now there was only quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the projector, still showing the affidavit on screen like an unblinking witness. Wallace finally cleared his throat, his voice softer now. "Mr. Patel, please, let's maintain decorum." But the moment had already slipped. Crockett turned back to the audience. Not for applause, but for clarity. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, her voice resonating through the stillness. "What you are witnessing is not a performance. It is not a gotcha moment. It is a reckoning, the result of bringing facts to a stage where arrogance believed it could shout them down." She placed the affidavit beside the other documents, stacking them neatly. "This isn't personal. This is accountability." Patel looked cornered now, visibly breathing harder, scanning the room for someone, anyone, to interject, to rescue him, to redirect the narrative. But no one moved. Even his own supporters were quiet, staring at the screen, the pages, the weight of it all. His face, moments earlier, smug and unbothered, now twitched with the recognition that this, the documents, the silence, the stillness, was the story being written in real time. Crockett didn't press the advantage with glee. She simply let the record speak. Calmly, devastatingly. The folder wasn't empty. The silence wasn't weakness. And her calm wasn't submission. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Patel. It was proof that she didn't need to overpower him to undo him. She just needed to be prepared. And she was. As Patel's voice collapsed under the weight of his own unraveling, and the silence grew too heavy for him to fill, Jasmine Crockett didn't need to escalate. She simply stood, not as a politician seeking attention, but as a reckoning given form. She rose with the deliberate grace of someone who understood the magnitude of the moment. Someone who didn't need to fight for the floor anymore because the floor itself had surrendered to her presence. The stage lights, once harsh, now seemed to soften around her figure as she placed one hand on the table, the other resting lightly atop the stack of government-issued truths that had silenced her opponent. She didn't look rushed, didn't look angry, didn't even look triumphant. She looked resolved, and when she spoke, her voice didn't punch through the silence. It replaced it. "There's something deeply wrong with the way we equate volume with value in this country," she began, her tone low, intimate, yet projected with the clarity of a bell. "Some people come into rooms like this and think the person who shouts the loudest wins, that if they interrupt enough, repeat something often enough, eventually it becomes truth." She turned slowly toward Patel, her gaze not sharp, not even confrontational, just undeniable. "But let me say this clearly, once and for all. The loudest person in the room is not always the right one." A stir swept through the room, a shift in posture, a stilling of restless feet, the universal silence of people leaning in. Crockett didn't press the moment for applause. She didn't ask for validation. She simply stood in the center of a storm she had refused to shout through, and reminded the room what stillness felt like when it carried purpose. "I came here tonight knowing exactly how this would go. I knew I'd be dismissed, interrupted, and disrespected before I ever opened my mouth. That's not new, that's not surprising." She paused, her jaw firming as the words settled in her chest. "But I didn't come here to win a volume contest. I came here to remind you that substance still matters." She stepped to the side of the table now, hand gesturing toward the glowing screen behind her. Still bearing Patel's name, and the paragraph from the Inspector General's report that had gutted his defense. "That document? It's not mine. I didn't write it. I didn't interpret it. I didn't dramatize it. It was written, reviewed, and released by the Department of Defense, by people who do understand national security." Her voice never broke its rhythm. "And that's the difference between us. I bring evidence. You bring ego. I bring facts. You bring fury." She turned back to the audience now, her full height silhouetted against a wall of exposed truth. "National security isn't something you perform. It's something you protect. It doesn't bend to personality. It doesn't yield to charisma. It requires character." There was no sound in the room but her voice and the low electric hum of the stage lights. And then she said it, the line that would cut through every replay, every highlight reel, every social media loop for the next 48 hours. "National security requires ethics, not theatrics." She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The sentence landed like judgment, a line of pure weight that dragged the room into sudden, collective understanding. For a heartbeat, the silence held. Then it shattered. Applause burst like a dam breaking, first in pockets, then sweeping across the room like a rising tide of recognition. People stood. They didn't just clap. They rose to their feet with the urgency of a courtroom reacting to a verdict too powerful to ignore. Phones came out, capturing the moment. Even those who hadn't cheered earlier now stood stunned, some clapping, some staring in awe, all understanding that they had just witnessed something not rehearsed, but earned. The sound swelled, not celebratory, but reverent. A standing ovation, not for charisma, but for clarity. And in the middle of it all, Kash Patel remained seated, still, frozen. His hands, once animated and dismissive, were now clasped tightly together, the knuckles white with tension. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scoff. He didn't attempt to recover the narrative, because he couldn't, not anymore. His eyes, once sharp with superiority, now flicked down toward the documents. The paper trail he could no longer outrun. The very thing he had spent the evening mocking had risen like a tidal wave and buried him. He had walked in expecting a fight, but what he got was a trial and a verdict, not by vote or party or bias, but by the undeniable weight of truth, calmly delivered. As the applause softened and the lights dimmed just enough to signal the end of the confrontation, the spotlight no longer rested on the debate, but on what came next, who left broken, and who stood unshaken. Kash Patel rose from his chair too quickly, the back legs scraping across the polished studio floor like metal teeth on glass. A shrill sound that punctuated the silence he'd once filled with swagger. His face, moments ago flushed with contempt, had drained to a pale tightness around the jaw. He didn't linger. He didn't shake hands. He didn't even attempt eye contact with the moderator or the audience that had watched him crumble in real time. His footsteps echoed sharply as he strode off stage, his phone already pressed against his ear like a lifeline. "Get me Greg. Now, no delays," he muttered, his voice low but clipped with urgency, panic leaking through cracks he could no longer conceal. His staff, once clustered behind the cameras with arms crossed and smug confidence, now scrambled behind him, their faces pale, movements clipped, unsure whether to follow or disappear. A junior aide reached to adjust Patel's mic, but he slapped the hand away, the gesture swift and dismissive. His world was no longer under his command, and he knew it. The man who had walked in ready to dominate had become a man trying to escape the room before the headlines caught up with him. Behind the curtain, red light from an illuminated exit sign cast jagged shadows on the concrete floor. Patel's voice echoed faintly from the corridor, sharp and frustrated. "No, we're not waiting. We release a statement before morning. Damage control, hit her on partisanship, twist the documents. I don't care. Just bury the optics." He didn't know the cameras had picked up everything. He didn't realize the damage was already done, not just to his credibility, but to the illusion that had shielded it for years. Now it was gone, undone not by theatrics, but by quiet, methodical truth. Back on stage, the contrast could not have been starker. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her posture still composed, the tension in her shoulders dissipating not in relief, but in resolution. She hadn't celebrated. She hadn't even smiled. The victory was not one of triumph. It was one of restoration, of reclaiming space where she'd been expected to falter. A young staffer emerged from the wings, his expression somewhere between awe and disbelief, offering her a bottle of water with both hands. She accepted it gently, uncapping it in silence, then took a slow sip. Her movements were unhurried, intentional, the same way she had conducted herself throughout the storm. Her eyes scanned the crowd briefly, not to measure applause, but to anchor herself in the reality of what had just transpired. She had not only survived the ambush, she had inverted it. Chris Wallace, who had watched the evening begin with a powder keg and end with something far more precise, approached her now with the quiet step of someone unsure whether they were speaking to a politician or a moment. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice low, softened in tone and stripped of performance. "I've moderated a lot of exchanges, but that was something else." Crockett turned toward him, her expression unreadable for a breath. Not guarded, but heavy with lived experience, that no segment runtime could contain. "It wasn't about him," she said finally, placing the now half-empty bottle on the table. "It was about reminding people that the truth still matters, even when someone tries to shout over it." Wallace nodded, not out of courtesy, but in the way a man nods when the weight of what he just witnessed hasn't finished landing. For a moment, no one spoke. The studio crew lingered, their hands frozen over equipment. The control room didn't cut to commercial right away. No one moved, as if the silence itself had become sacred. And in the quiet, Jasmine Crockett sat, not victorious, not vanquished, but still, exactly where she had been all along, while the storm raged, while the accusations flew, while the air was thick with smirks and dismissiveness and noise. She had waited, she had spoken, and she had stayed. As Crockett calmly stepped off the stage, leaving behind papers, silence, and a dismantled opponent, the confrontation may have ended under studio lights, but its second life had just begun, unfolding across newsrooms like aftershocks from an earthquake no one had predicted. At exactly 8:47 p.m. Eastern, 12 minutes after the cameras cut to black, the first digital headline went live. The Washington Post didn't hesitate. Their homepage lit up with a single image: Jasmine Crockett, standing tall with her hand resting atop a stack of government reports. And beneath it, the headline, "Congresswoman Crockett flips the room in explosive national security showdown." The subtext struck harder. Freshman lawmaker delivers evidence-backed rebuke to Trump-era official, leaving town hall audience in stunned silence. Inside the article, Crockett was described as a force of discipline in the face of derision, while Patel's evening was referred to, not gently, as a collapse under the weight of unchallenged arrogance. This wasn't a recap. It was a reckoning in print. The piece included full transcripts, freeze frames of damning documents, and a minute-by-minute breakdown of Patel's unraveling. By 9 p.m., the article had been shared thousands of times across syndicates and pushed to mobile alerts as a breaking political moment. At 9:06 p.m., Politico followed, not with commentary, but with a post-mortem. Their headline read, "The receipts speak, Crockett's calculated strike at Patel redefines congressional clashes." The opening paragraph pulled no punches. In an age where outrage often overshadows truth, one congresswoman came armed not with fury, but with files. The analysis dissected Crockett's strategy like military doctrine, calling her delivery judicially precise, her tone devastating in its restraint, and her timing calculated down to the breath. Politico's writers, typically cagey with praise, made an exception this time. One senior columnist described it as the rare political moment where fact eclipses theater and preparation beats performance. The article didn't need flair. Crockett had supplied all the impact. It concluded with a chilling line. For Patel, the damage may not be his reputation alone, but the precedent this sets for anyone mistaking volume for victory. By 9:18 p.m., Reuters released a dispatch that swept wire services in over 40 countries. Theirs was cooler, stripped of drama, but no less damning. Headlined, "Congresswoman Challenges Trump-Era Official in Televised Exchange Over Classified Conduct." The piece carried the weight of neutrality like a blade, quiet but surgical. The article confirmed the authenticity of the documents displayed on air and included quotes from senior intelligence analysts who, when pressed, admitted the revelations raised serious questions about past protocol compliance. The impact wasn't in the wording, it was in the reach. Reuters' feed pushed the story into hundreds of international outlets, from the BBC to Le Monde. Crockett's name, once regional, had gone global. What was once a confrontation had become an international headline. And then, inevitably, Fox News responded. At 9:41 p.m., their homepage changed. The headline, "Stage Showdown?" Crockett ambushes Patel in CNN political trap. Their article didn't focus on the documents. It barely quoted Crockett. Instead, it zeroed in on Patel's reaction, framing him as targeted by a coordinated smear effort using declassified and cherry-picked information. The piece leaned heavily on anonymous sources inside senior GOP media strategy teams, with one quoted as saying, "This wasn't debate, It was entrapment under studio lighting. On the Ingram angle, a segment aired titled Trial by Optics: How the Left Uses Theater to Manipulate Truth. It featured a selectively edited clip of Patel mid-sentence, his tone sharp, his words cut just before his outburst. There was no mention of the Inspector General's report, no images of the affidavit. Just a talking point repeated over and over. This was never about facts, it was about ambush. But the damage was done. On other networks, the narrative had already cemented. CNN's morning anchors replayed the entire segment uninterrupted. MSNBC's primetime commentary dissected it frame by frame. The Hill ran a headline by 10 p.m. Crockett's calm dismantles Patel's defense in televised firestorm. Even neutral networks like PBS and NPR covered it with quiet astonishment. The consensus was universal, even if the political interpretations weren't. This wasn't planned, but it was earned. And therein lay the injustice Crockett had faced and obliterated. She hadn't come to the town hall with the backing of legacy. She wasn't surrounded by establishment media teams or decades-long reputations. She was a first-term congresswoman walking into a trap laid by someone with years of Washington muscle and media polish. And yet, that very imbalance became the axis of reversal. The injustice of being underestimated, of being talked over, sidelined, dismissed as ornamental, had not only failed to silence her, it had become fuel. The moment she opened that black folder, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. And now, as the headlines circled the globe, the imbalance wasn't just acknowledged, it was documented. Meanwhile, conservative strategists scrambled behind closed doors. At least 3 internal memos, leaked by midnight, revealed panic. One, obtained by Axios, read, "We failed to prepare Patel for the possibility of document-based attacks. Crisis teams should begin redirecting attention to broader issues unrelated to classified handling." Another warned, "Do not allow Crockett's moment to dominate the next 48-hour news cycle. Reframe as partisan smear." But even inside the right-wing ecosystem, cracks formed. Not all were willing to carry water this time. A Republican operative told Punchbowl News anonymously, "Look, we've seen a lot of disasters, but this wasn't a slip-up. It was a tactical defeat." Crockett, meanwhile, said nothing. Her press team released no gloating statement. Her office posted no immediate video clip. While headlines clashed and networks spun, she remained silent, because she didn't need to speak. The truth had already spoken for her. As headlines hardened into legacy and political strategists scrambled to patch a bleeding narrative, something far stranger and more potent began to take shape. Crockett wasn't just being reported on. She was being canonized. It started slowly, like the early wind before a storm. A clip here, a quote there. A late-night talk show host mouthing Crockett's final line, "National security requires ethics, not theatrics," to thunderous applause. But by morning it was unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett had not merely survived a televised political crossfire, she had detonated it and walked through the smoke untouched. Her inbox was flooded before sunrise. Requests from advocacy groups, campaign bundlers, universities, even late-night programs. One email from a DC donor simply read, "More of this. Name your number." Within 72 hours, her campaign had raised more than $1.4 million. Not from super PACs, from retired teachers, from postal workers, from nurses and bus drivers and veterans who said they saw themselves in her, the clarity, the courage, the composure. Invitations rolled in like tides during a supermoon. Harvard wanted her to deliver a guest lecture on evidence-based political discourse. A bipartisan integrity committee asked her to keynote a summit in Denver. CNN extended a standing offer for commentary slots. Even Hollywood circled. A producer from a major streaming network sent a confidential inquiry. "Has anyone optioned this yet?" Her communications director laughed when she saw it, but she didn't delete it. Because by then, even Crockett knew, this was no longer a one-off. She had crossed a threshold. Online, the shift was volcanic. The phrase, "Don't Patel this," began circulating on forums by the second evening, usually paired with a grainy screenshot of Patel's stunned expression as Crockett revealed the affidavit. Reddit threads turned it into a verb. I almost pateled my presentation, but then I triple-checked my footnotes. Instagram turned it into a visual language. Patel photos with red X's, Crockett folders haloed in light. And then came the t-shirts. White block letters on black cotton. Bring receipts like Crockett. Within 48 hours, they were selling faster than the printers could restock. But it wasn't just digital. The moment breached reality like floodwater through drywall. In an open-plan office in Atlanta, a mid-level tech team watched the town hall replay during lunch. By the final minute, someone, half joking, half awed, stood up and clapped. The others followed. In a high school civics class in Michigan, a teacher paused after showing the clip and asked, "What made her effective?" A student raised her hand and said, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." In a church group discussion in Dallas, Crockett's moment replaced the evening scripture reading. "This," the pastor said, pointing to the screen, "is what faith and truth looks like in action." Even corporate boardrooms felt the tremor. One major pharmaceutical firm held an internal seminar on evidence-based communication, with Crockett's performance cited as an ideal model for strategic de-escalation under hostile conditions. A labor union in Pennsylvania printed flyers with her image under the words, "Speak with facts, hold the line." In one viral clip, a group of nurses held up signs that read, "In healthcare, as in politics, always bring receipts." The phrase had transformed. It wasn't slang anymore. It was a new kind of mantra, but behind the glamour, behind the overnight fame, the injustice that birthed it still hummed like an electric current. Because none of it was given, it had to be fought for. Crockett had walked into that studio at Target, booked to be a foil, cast as a side character in someone else's script. The moderators knew the setup. The staff had briefed Patel with pre-selected sound bites. Crockett was supposed to be background noise, acceptable, containable opposition. But she came in with more than presence. She came in prepared, and preparation was the one thing they hadn't accounted for. Now the irony was unavoidable. The woman they underestimated had become a mirror to their failure. And every time a new meme spread, every time a high schooler referenced her folder in debate club, the injustice looped back, exposed not with outrage, but with poise. That's what made it sting. Crockett never screamed. She didn't slam a fist or storm out. She proved that discipline could be more explosive than any outburst. By the fifth day, political analysts began whispering about what they once scoffed at. Could she be a national contender? One even floated the idea on live TV. I mean, if this is her first year in Congress, what's she capable of by year 6? Others dismissed it. Too soon, too flashy. But the footage kept playing. Again, and again, and again. In airports, in classrooms, in cafeterias. The moment had seeded itself into the culture. It wasn't just Crockett's victory, it was the blueprint. And America was watching. Not because she demanded to be heard, but because she proved what happens when the ignored bring the truth. And the room has no choice but to listen. But while the public clung to Crockett's moment like a national epiphany, the halls of power pulsed with something colder. Calculation, hesitation, and for some, fear. Because when a single moment rewrites the rules of engagement, Washington doesn't clap, it recalibrates. The first official response came not in the form of a speech, but a whisper, a carefully worded congratulatory post from Senator Elizabeth Warren. It read, "Integrity is not volume. Facts are not opinions. Proud to serve alongside leaders like Representative Jasmine Crockett." The subtext wasn't hard to read. Crockett had done what many veteran Democrats failed to do: face down a Trump-era operator without flinching or fumbling. Hours later, Representative Ro Khanna followed suit, stating in a live MSNBC appearance, "We've got new blood, and they don't just talk, they deliver." The praise rippled outward. Progressive groups floated the idea of placing Crockett on the Oversight Committee's intelligence subpanel. Behind closed doors, party strategists were already drawing lines around her face in campaign materials marked 2026. A junior staffer from the House Democratic Caucus admitted bluntly, "If we don't elevate her now, we're fools." But not all reactions were built on celebration. On the Republican side, a different strategy took hold. Contain, but do not engage. Speaker Mike Johnson issued a short, clipped statement. "We believe in transparency and civility in public discourse. Mr. Patel remains a valued voice on national security." No mention of the documents. No comment on the substance. Representative Jim Jordan, normally a pit bull for partisan defense, chose uncharacteristic silence. Behind the scenes, however, GOP communications staff were in triage mode. Leaked messages revealed debates over how to spin the fallout. Some wanted to attack Crockett's tone. Others feared that would backfire and amplify her calm strength. "She didn't lose her cool," one aide reportedly warned in a group chat, "which makes her 10 times more dangerous." Even Fox News' internal memo, obtained by a media watchdog group, instructed on-air personalities to refer to the town hall as confrontational, not damaging, and to avoid repeating any quotes from the Inspector General's report Crockett had used. But the tremors extended further than Capitol Hill. Inside the Pentagon, red flags were quietly raised. A confidential request surfaced from the Defense Intelligence Agency, directing an internal audit of declassification protocols tied to Patel's previous tenure. A former assistant general counsel at the DoD posted a carefully worded tweet that read, "When theatrics intersect with compromised data pathways, risk doesn't disappear, it multiplies." A second source, anonymous but credible, told Politico that multiple documents Crockett referenced were already flagged in a previous investigation, but shelved due to lack of external pressure. Now, the pressure was no longer external. It was viral, it was bipartisan, and it was demanding blood. Meanwhile, a coalition of retired generals, including two who had served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, released a joint letter. It didn't mention Patel by name. It didn't have to. It emphasized the vital importance of consistency and ethical stewardship in the handling of classified materials, and warned against the normalization of reckless behavior cloaked as patriotism. Defense forums lit up overnight. On an Air Force veterans message board, one user posted, "If what she said on live TV is even 60% accurate, there are people in the system who need to start lawyering up." The pressure inside Patel's camp escalated into chaos. 3 aides reportedly walked out within 48 hours of the town hall, citing ethical discomfort and media mismanagement. One email leaked from a communications chain showed an urgent plea to a crisis PR firm. "We need an exit strategy. We cannot win this news cycle." Patel himself vanished from television. A scheduled appearance on a podcast hosted by a conservative think tank was abruptly canceled. No explanation given, no reschedule promised, and all the while Crockett said nothing. She let the system speak for her. Let the machinery she challenged begin turning inward. She had cracked the armor, and now the institutions were inspecting their own bruises. That was the deepest cut of all, not that she had shouted over her opponent, but that she had made him irrelevant while revealing the cracks he once exploited. The imbalance she endured, that of walking into a forum set against her, of being labeled a novice in a space dominated by legacy and connections, had become the foundation for a reckoning no one could mute. In one closed-door meeting of the House Intelligence Committee, a Republican member reportedly paused halfway through a briefing and said, "We need to separate Cash's past access from our future credibility." No one argued, not even his own staff. As whispers hardened into investigations and the fault lines deepened across agencies and parties, Patel did what wounded men in politics often do. He ran to friendly fire, hoping it would burn differently. He appeared 3 days later on a hard-right podcast called The Patriot's Gate. The lighting was tight, colors saturated in crimson and chrome, and the host, veteran conservative flamethrower Mason Grant, was already baiting the hook before the camera even rolled. "We all saw the ambush," Grant opened. CNN, a liberal moderator, a Democrat congresswoman with a folder full of who knows what. It smelled like a setup. Patel leaned in with rehearsed indignation, his voice lower, slower, less manic than during the town hall. "That's exactly what it was," he replied. "A political hit. They framed the conversation to make me the villain before a single question was asked. It wasn't oversight. It was entrapment." He nodded confidently, as if trying to rewrite his memory in real time. And let's be clear, he added, eyes narrowing into the camera. This wasn't about national security. This was a coordinated attack to discredit conservatives who dare to speak bluntly. I was too effective, so they went digging for garbage, packaged it up in a fancy folder, and let the media do the rest. Grant nodded approvingly, but there was a flicker, just a flicker of hesitation behind his eyes. And then came the crack. But Cash, Grant said slowly, rubbing his hands together like a man walking into a fire he didn't start. You say the documents were weaponized. Okay, but just for clarity, are you saying the Inspector General's report was fake? The pause was volcanic. Patel's eyes twitched, and his shoulders rose a fraction too high. I'm saying it was framed, he answered, taken out of context, leaked selectively. But the edge had dulled. The fire was no longer rage, it was smoke. The clip went viral within hours, not as a vindication, but as a backpedal in HD. The internet chewed it up. So it's real, but not real, one user quipped under the video. Late-night shows clipped the moment with the caption, Cash crashes in 17 seconds. Meanwhile, across the airwaves, Crockett returned, not as a warrior, but as an architect. She appeared on MSNBC's The Last Word, seated in front of the Capitol Dome, dressed in navy with a single gold pin at her collar. The tone was different now. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was laying out a path. What happened on that stage wasn't a takedown, she told host Lawrence O'Donnell. It was a reckoning with truth. And the fact that truth makes people uncomfortable doesn't mean it's an ambush. It means it's overdue. O'Donnell leaned in, clearly captivated. Congresswoman, walk us through the moment when you decided to bring classified oversight into public light, without compromising national security. She nodded, calm, composed. We did what Congress is supposed to do. We reviewed the Inspector General's findings. We corroborated with non-classified documents. We redacted what we had to. And we followed the protocols to expose misconduct while protecting the system. Then came the pivot, sharp, principled, surgical. But the bigger question, she said, is why this took a viral moment for anyone to pay attention. Our system of oversight is broken. It hides behind classified whenever accountability is inconvenient. It buries whistleblowers in process. I'm calling for a full transparency reform, one that ensures the public knows when their public servants are violating national ethics under the guise of national defense. O'Donnell nodded, nearly breathless. So you're saying this moment wasn't just about one official? It's about all of them, Crockett cut in, her voice steel-coated. This is bigger than Patel. This is about every lie hiding behind a redacted stamp. The reaction was immediate. Progressive lawmakers began circulating her transparency proposal before the interview even ended. Twitter lit up with policy wonks dissecting every word. A retired intelligence liaison from DHS posted a rare statement. Rep. Crockett didn't just call for reform, she outlined the template, and even conservative outlets were forced to take note. The National Review ran a headline that grudgingly admitted, Crockett's case for oversight, substance over showmanship. In the days that followed, the difference between the two camps became increasingly clear. Patel clung to spectacle, conspiracies, dramatics, vague threats of lawsuits. Crockett dealt in architecture, policy, strategy. The very tools Patel once mocked her for not having. She had flipped the equation. And while he spiraled, she built. No press releases, no rage. Just structure, delivered like a scalpel to a narrative that no longer obeyed his control. But as Patel's narrative unraveled and Crockett's reforms gained oxygen, something even more enduring began to crystallize. Not just a victory, but a blueprint. And across Washington's stone halls and media green rooms, a question surfaced that hadn't been asked in years. What if truth could be rehearsed, sharpened, and deployed like a weapon? It started quietly. At first, just a few congressional interns whispering in committee prep rooms, then legislative aides shuffling printouts into the hands of their bosses with newfound urgency. A young freshman representative from Nevada entered a Veterans Affairs hearing 2 weeks later with a thick black binder marked FOIA-backed exhibits. He laid it on the table like a warning. Inspired by Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice steady, his tone unmistakably clear. The old ways of debating, rhetoric without receipts, fury without facts, were beginning to feel outdated. On both sides of the aisle, staffers started embedding links in talking points, cross-checking Inspector General reports, even color-coding public records to anticipate ambushes in real time. They weren't just writing speeches anymore. They were building cases. Cable pundits called it a generational shift, but the New York Times gave it a name that stuck: the Crockett effect. Above a photo of Jasmine Crockett at the CNN town hall, folder open, eyes locked, silence weaponized, they printed the headline, "She didn't yell, she proved." Overnight, the phrase exploded. From Capitol Hill to law schools to corporate workshops on political communication, the Crockett effect became shorthand for something rare: victory through evidence, not ego. NPR's Morning Edition ran a segment titled "The New Rules of Political Engagement," featuring clips of Crockett layered over a string quartet and voiceovers explaining how her performance rewired public expectations. Not louder, just smarter; not wilder, just more prepared. Within weeks, the ripple spread beyond politics. At George Washington University, a political science professor rewrote his syllabus. Chapter 14, Argumentation in the Age of Optics, was renamed Chapter 14, The Crockett Doctrine. Debate clubs from Texas to Oregon began circulating bootleg transcripts of the town hall like contraband scripture. Students memorized Crockett's phrasing, rehearsed the moment she laid down the sworn whistleblower statement. One debate coach even created a new exercise, the folder drop drill, teaching students not just how to make an argument, but how to time it, deliver it, and own it like Crockett did on live television. Meanwhile, Capitol Hill communications consultants, once focused solely on image, posture, lighting, pivoted hard. Slide decks now opened with receipt-based messaging strategy, the Crockett framework. Clients were told, if you can't show it, don't say it. Even high-level consultants who previously dismissed documentation as wonkish baggage began coaching senators on how to weaponize footnotes. The new mantra in war rooms wasn't "stay on message," it was "bring the files." But while the effect thrilled rising leaders, it unsettled the establishment. Several veteran lawmakers grumbled privately that the new trend risked turning every hearing into a courtroom circus. "This isn't a deposition," one senator scoffed to Politico, "it's governance." But that was precisely what made Crockett's style dangerous, because it was governance. It was constitutional duty sharpened with 21st century tools, and it didn't ask permission to be effective. It didn't need seniority, it needed proof. And the public, especially the disillusioned, the forgotten, the digitally fluent, recognized it instantly. Not just as competence, but as justice made legible. Late-night hosts mocked the backlash, airing a viral skit, an actor playing an old-school politician sputtering through a debate, while a faux Crockett calmly rolls in a dolly stacked with government binders. "I brought charts," she says. "You brought vibes." The real Crockett, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She didn't take a victory tour. She didn't chase the spotlight. Instead, she returned to her office and submitted a proposal to the House Rules Committee for mandatory digital public access to declassified oversight reports. No cameras, no fanfare. Just systems, being rebuilt, one receipt at a time. When asked in a brief hallway interview what she thought about the phenomenon named after her, she shrugged. "I didn't try to start anything," she said. "I just refused to come unarmed." By now, the headlines had faded into the digital archives, and the viral clips began their slow descent into the rearview mirror of political memory. But long after the studio lights dimmed and the applause was archived, one truth remained. Not about Crockett or Patel, but about something bigger: what it takes to cut through the chaos of an era addicted to distortion. In an age where noise ruled, where the loudest voice often drowned out the most accurate one, Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak, she executed. She didn't perform for the cameras. She didn't brandish anger as a strategy or volume as a substitute for values. She carried truth into battle like a soldier might carry a final bullet. Not for show, but for survival. And when she laid that truth on the table, not screamed, not leaked, but verified, timed, and televised, she did more than defend herself. She broke the spell. The one that said being aggressive meant being right. The one that taught us to measure conviction by fury, not fact. Crockett's silence between interruptions wasn't hesitation, it was discipline. Her steady gaze wasn't defiance, it was control. In a format designed for chaos, she was stillness. And in that stillness, she made something devastatingly clear. Truth still works when delivered with precision, not panic. When timed like a scalpel, not hurled like a grenade, and when voiced by someone who does not fear consequences, but understands them. That's why her performance struck deeper than a viral win. It wasn't just what she revealed. The Inspector General's report, the retaliatory documents, the whistleblower's sworn statement, it was how she revealed it. She made preparation look like power. She made documentation feel like a weapon. And she made millions reevaluate a dangerous myth, that the best debater is the one who yells the loudest. Even her harshest critics, left fumbling in the wreckage of spin, could not erase the core truth of what unfolded on that stage. Crockett didn't simply win the confrontation. She rewrote the criteria for what winning even meant. It wasn't about gotcha moments. It was about governing moments. It was about turning oversight into action and cameras into courtrooms, where the public could witness real accountability, not theatrical stunts. And so her legacy wasn't the applause. It wasn't the trending hashtags or the glowing editorials. It was a shift in posture. Young staffers now walked into briefings with folders, not slogans. Town halls suddenly felt less like cage matches and more like depositions. And somewhere in the subtext of every media appearance, every press conference, every hearing, her shadow loomed, quiet, prepared, and ready. That shift, quiet but irreversible, was what made the Crockett effect not just a moment, but a mutation. Political DNA changed. Suddenly, a rising generation of leaders understood that facts weren't cumbersome, they were nuclear. And if delivered correctly, with timing, tone, and calm, they could obliterate months of spin in a single sentence. Crockett's sentence was simple. National security demands ethics, not theatrics. It wasn't screamed. It wasn't dressed up. But when she said it, an entire room stood. And one man went silent. Behind the curtain, aides at multiple federal agencies were already revising internal playbooks. The Office of Congressional Liaison quietly recommended that department heads review IG reports for vulnerabilities prior to public testimony. Think tanks cited her exchange in discussions about how to train diplomats. Private sector boards even hosted strategy sessions based on her cadence. Her calm assertiveness in the face of confrontation. What she modeled wasn't just courage, it was a system. And once seen, it could not be unseen. For months after, her speech was dissected like case law. Professors screened the town hall alongside classics like the Army McCarthy hearings and Anita Hill's testimony. But unlike those past moments, Crockett didn't rely on public sympathy or personal narrative. She relied on receipts. She didn't beg to be heard. She made silence impossible. And because of that, the aftershocks weren't just political, they were institutional. People began to ask, what happens when emotional clarity meets procedural mastery? The answer, it turned out, was Crockett. She became a case study, not in personality, but in execution under fire. Her victory wasn't cinematic because it was explosive. It was cinematic because it was surgical. She let her opponent overplay his hand, let the room build tension, let the viewers lean forward. And then, at the moment when bluster reached its highest pitch, she opened a folder and detonated restraint. Not chaos, not revenge, but consequence. And in doing so, she didn't just finish an argument. She ended an era. The age of empty outrage had met its match. Years from now, students of law and leadership will still be watching that clip, pausing it, rewinding it, studying the twitch of her hand before she turned the first page. And in every setting where spin threatens truth, someone will whisper, "Bring the folder." It won't be about paperwork, it'll be about readiness. The kind that doesn't fear the truth, but prepares for it. The kind that doesn't perform for applause, but for impact. That is what Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a moment of dominance, but a methodology of clarity. A new archetype for the political warrior. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the one whose calm was crafted, whose argument was armed, and whose victory was not shouted, but delivered with such deliberate weight that silence became the loudest sound in the room. And in that silence, a new standard was born, one that will echo far beyond that studio stage, but beyond the headlines, beyond the viral clips and replays dissected by pundits and professors alike. Something deeper lingered, something not about performance or strategy, but about the quiet, burning lesson that every injustice, every dismissal, every interruption had etched into the soul of that moment. A lesson not just for politics, but for life. The most devastating moments in history aren't always the loudest. Sometimes the sharpest revolutions happen not when someone screams, but when someone refuses to lower their voice. That's what Jasmine Crockett proved, not just with her facts, not just with her evidence, but with the unshakable stillness of someone who has been underestimated her entire life and still chose not to flinch. What made her victory human wasn't the folder she held. It was the decades she carried in silence before that folder ever touched her fingertips. The years of being told she was too emotional, too young, too loud, too black. The rooms where her intelligence was questioned before she ever spoke. The panels where her resume was ignored, and her tone dissected more than her argument. And still, she showed up, and she waited, and she prepared. It's easy to believe that the world changes through explosion, but Crockett taught us that change also comes through patience, through documenting what they think you'll never find, through listening longer than they expect, through holding back until the exact second the lie collapses on its own weight. It's a lesson forged in every woman who's had her ideas stolen in a meeting, in every whistleblower told to stay silent for the good of the institution, in every underdog who was told to wait their turn, but knew that turn would never come unless they made it. In that moment, Crockett didn't just take her turn. She created the conditions that made denying it impossible. And yet, even as the nation cheered, the human cost remained unspoken. Because for someone like her, the fight isn't just for a moment, it's daily. Every word she said that night had to be perfect. Every fact had to be verified, every document sourced, every sentence measured. Because one misstep would have been weaponized, not just against her, but against every woman who looked like her, every outsider who dared to speak. Her margin for error wasn't narrow, it was non-existent. That's the part most people missed. Her victory wasn't just impressive, it was required for survival, and she pulled it off anyway. That's where the lesson lives, not in the applause, but in the pressure she endured to earn it. In a world that often confuses cruelty with strength and noise with truth, she modeled a rare form of resistance, grace under fire. She didn't need to shout to be powerful. She didn't need to mock to be memorable. She didn't need to destroy someone's dignity to defend her own. She came armed with something infinitely rarer: integrity backed by evidence and ethics shaped by struggle. And that, in the end, is the human core of what happened. It wasn't a political triumph. It was a moral calibration, because it told us something we'd forgotten, that truth doesn't have to shout to win, that composure isn't weakness, it's courage with its back straight, that when the odds are rigged, when the stage is stacked, and when even the host hesitates to interrupt the aggressor, you can still win by staying ready, not bitter, by choosing the moment, not reacting to the bait, by being the keeper of the truth, not just the target of the narrative. In Jasmine Crockett's silence before she spoke, there was a lesson. In her precision when she did, there was a blueprint. And in the moment Patel realized he couldn't shout her down, there was a reckoning. She didn't just bring receipts. She brought the reminder that in a world of orchestrated distraction, truth still cuts through, if delivered by someone who dares to carry it to the front lines and doesn't blink. That's the story that stayed long after the credits rolled. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.